Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Seawright, and I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, which is housed in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. As a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's event, a discussion with Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Camille Dawson, on Indo-Pacific strategy. As a reminder, today's event is open to the public and on the record. For our in-person audience, during the Q&A session, please make your way to the microphone at the side of the room if you'd like to ask a question. And for audience members who are joining virtually via Zoom, YouTube, X, and Facebook, you can submit your questions at any time by visiting askac.org. And our moderator will raise any relevant questions with Deputy Assistant Secretary Dawson if there's time. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently introduced the concept of diplomatic variable geometry to capture the U.S. approach to cooperation in this new era. And I think it's really exciting that we're starting to see real progress and innovative thinking on how to conceptualize and launch frameworks with a small number of partners, what we call minilateral cooperation, as building blocks to supplant cooperation in broader multilateral frameworks, as well as our strong bilateral security alliances in the region. This creates a kind of multi-layered approach to cooperation in a mutually reinforcing regional security architecture. So it seems that minilateralism as an organizing principle is a concept whose time has come. But why now? What is this particular geometry? Why is it currently taking center stage? Actually, it's been a long time coming. Minilateral cooperation in the security domain was first proposed as something the U.S. should prioritize in the East Asia Strategy Review put out by the Pentagon in 1998. And the idea was that minilateral arrangements created creative and flexible approaches to emerging transnational problems that we were beginning to see in the early 21st century. And as the East Asia Strategy Report put it, the continuation and broadening of minilateral contacts will remain a U.S. strategic priority and take its place alongside traditional mechanisms of dialogue in the coming years. That was 25 years ago. But we did not actually see that much development on this front for some time. And this is because, I would argue, the hub and spokes system of bilateral security alliances with the United States continued to reign supreme in U.S. policy circles in the first decade of the 21st century. So even though a number of proposals, for example, were floated for a Northeast Asia security dialogue around this time, including one that I worked on when I was in the State Department in 2003, 2004 on the policy planning staff, these proposals did not take off, other than the six-party talks that emerged to deal specifically with the disarmament of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. Many of us in those years were also quite concerned about Malaysia's announcement in 2004 that it was going to launch an East Asia summit to bring together partners in the region. But the United States at the time was quite complacent to sit on the sidelines of this new regional grouping and chose not to join. And the U.S. reluctance to join was due in part to the tension or the perceived tension between the hub and spokes model and minilateral and multilateral frameworks for cooperation. Many U.S. strategists worried about undercutting bilateral security alliances and the need to strengthen those alliances, especially with Japan, Australia, and the ROK. The reluctance was also driven by overall frustration with East Asian multilateral frameworks, including those led by ASEAN, but also APEC, which were consensus-driven and often resulted in rather meager, lowest common denominator outcomes. The East Asia Summit, in this light, was seen as a potentially just another talk shop, and U.S. strategists at the time did not want to empower this kind of organization. But even in these years, there was some appreciation of the value of some trilateral or minilateral frameworks, and we did see the formation of the Trilateral Security Dialogue with Japan, the United States, and Australia, the initial launch of the Quad, and the six-party talks, which I've mentioned. And then over the next decade, we began to see more embrace of these smaller, more flexible arrangements. On the defense side, we saw growing addition of partners to bilateral military mill-to-mill training and exercises. There were vigorous attempts, again on the security side, to strengthen the US-Japan ROK trilateral security cooperation. Not always successful, but attempts nonetheless. There was the launch of the Lower Mekong Initiative with partners in the Mekong region in Southeast Asia. And in addition to the Quad, there was the launch of the US, Japan, India trilateral framework. And conceptually, Defense Secretary Ash Carter defined the US approach to Indo-Pacific security as a principled security network that combines bilateral, minilateral, and multilateral approaches to security cooperation. And now we're beginning to see the fruits of some of these early efforts and a real appreciation for the advantages and opportunities provided by minilateralism take center stage. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Deputy Assistant Secretary Dawson discuss how these minilateral engagements strengthen our Indo-Pacific strategy. Convening on topics such as this are integral to the Scowcroft Center mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Within the Scowcroft Center, the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative informs and shapes the strategies, plans, and policies of the United States and its allies and partners to address the rising security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. It produces innovative analysis, conducts tabletop exercises, convenes public and private dialogues, and engages with governments, militaries, media, and other stakeholders. So thank you again for joining us. And now I'd like to turn over to our moderator and the Atlantic Council's Senior Editorial Director, Ori Friedman.
Thank you, Amy, for those opening remarks. Really helped set the scene for this discussion today. I'm Ori Friedman. I'm the Senior Editorial Director at the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished speaker today. Camille Dawson is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with 24 years of experience designing and implementing diplomatic and public engagement strategies for the State Department. She assumed the role of Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs in September 2021. And in that position, she's responsible for public diplomacy as well as regional and security policy. Deputy Assistant Secretary Dawson previously served as Director of the Office of Public Diplomacy for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and in diplomatic postings in Singapore, South Africa, China, and the Philippines. She also serves as a board member of Executive Women at State. Deputy Assistant Secretary Dawson has a really unique perspective on how exactly our U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is developing and being put into practice in the region, and we're really looking forward to you sharing your perspective today. So with that, I want to give the floor to you for some opening remarks. So over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, Uri. And it's a real pleasure to be here today at the Atlantic Council to discuss the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and I thank the entire team here for creating this opportunity. As President Biden has said, the Indo-Pacific region will be the epicenter of 21st century geopolitics. That is a very significant strategic assessment, and the importance of the region is reflected in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as the similar strategies and approaches that have been released by many other countries, both within and outside of the region, countries such as Australia, Japan, the ROK, as well as ASEAN. Then outside of the region, you also have Canada, the UK, the EU, France, and more. So this chorus of voices articulating the importance of the Indo-Pacific really is a striking development that propels us to identify shared goals and objectives for the region, as well as opportunities to work together to address our shared challenges. One of the really key features of the US Indo-Pacific strategy is that it was developed by listening to our partners in the region about what they see as the greatest needs and the ways in which the United States can contribute most effectively. And it was through that process that we developed our vision. And that is a vision that is both shared by and informed by partners in the region. It's a vision for an Indo-Pacific that is free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. To advance the vision, the United States is identifying ways to leverage this convergence with others so that we can work in common cause. At the core of this strategy is the recognition that no one country can address all of the needs of the region alone. Therefore, we must support a regional architecture with mutually reinforcing coalitions that enable us to build capacity and tackle our shared problems together. In a recent speech at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Secretary Blinken articulated the global approach of diplomatic variable geometry, as Amy mentioned, and noted that that is a key component of building out the multilateral architecture. Now, if you're like me, you had to pause for a moment and think back to high school math and figure out exactly what that meant. But really, it's about starting with identifying the problems that we need to solve, and then working through our network of allies and partners and friends to build the strongest coalition of partners to address that particular problem set. It means that we have to use combinations that are flexible and fit for purpose. And these partnerships are part of our broader effort to fortify an international system founded upon multilateralism, weaving together our alliances and partnerships in mutually reinforcing ways across issues and continents. Since the US Indo-Pacific strategy was released almost 2 years ago, we have not only invested in deepening our engagement in the existing regional architecture, including through ASEAN, the Pacific Islands Forum, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and APEC, but we have also been working through newer partnerships and frameworks that are intended to complement the existing architecture. The Indo-Pacific region has been fertile ground for these minilateral partnerships precisely because we have a foundation of articulated strategies and partners who are committed to attaining concrete results and strengthening an international system that is rooted in diplomacy and cooperation in the face of truly unprecedented challenges in the region. Some of these newer partnerships include the Quad, AUKUS, Partners in the Blue Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific Framework for Prosperity, or IPAF. We have also deepened our trilateral engagement with the ROK and Japan, as was highlighted through the historic Camp David summit this past August. And we've formed the foundations for a trilateral partnership with Japan and the Philippines. We've also increased our coordination with the EU on shared objectives in the Indo-Pacific through the US-EU Indo-Pacific consultations. All of these partnerships allow us to leverage the varied capacities and comparative advantages of our partners so that we can deliver results for the region. Our shared efforts in the Indo-Pacific have proven the capacity of minilateral groupings to bring the resources and necessary cooperation to bear on key economic and security challenges. The Quad is a key example of the success of our approach. Originally, the Quad was convened for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. And the Quad has since brought together the US, Australia, India, and Japan to coordinate quickly with one another and to deliver tangible benefits to the region and its people on issues ranging from communications infrastructure to clean energy to maritime security. The Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, or IPMDA, that was launched by the Quad, is bringing cutting-edge satellite data to partners to better equip them to monitor their waters, improving their ability to counter illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and to enforce the law near their shores. The Quad is also delivering on key economic and infrastructure needs. The Quad Partnership for Cable Connectivity and Resilience provides technical assistance and capacity building to develop trusted and secure undersea cables communications infrastructure. And the Quad Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Package advances clean energy, climate, and disaster risk cooperation. The Quad may be the most mature minilateral in the Indo-Pacific, but other groups have developed significant benefits or have delivered significant benefits to the region as well. 2 years ago, President Biden, alongside the leaders from Australia and the United Kingdom, announced the creation of an enhanced trilateral security partnership, or AUKUS, to modernize our long-standing partnerships and address the security challenges of the future. AUKUS will better integrate the members' defense and security-related science, technology, industrial bases, and supply chains, as well as deepen cooperation on a range of defense and security capabilities, including cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, and other undersea capabilities. In March this year, we announced the optimal pathway for Australia to acquire conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines. And we continue to scope a variety of advanced capabilities to ensure we are prepared to meet the moment as the international security environment continues to rapidly change. These commitments will undergird the conditions of economic growth and prosperity in the region through enhanced deterrence, security, and stability. Just last month, the partners in the Blue Pacific held their second foreign ministers meeting with Pacific Islands partners and announced several flagship programs that will advance the Pacific Island Forum's 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. These efforts include investments to support the Pacific Humanitarian Warehousing Program, a Pacific-owned fisheries and oceans science research vessel, and coordination to combat IUU fishing. This past month, we worked with our partners to host the first Pacific Cyber Capacity Building and Cooperation Conference to advance cyber resilience in the Pacific by sharing tools and resources and coordinating capacity building initiatives. In August, President Biden welcomed Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and ROK President Yoon to a historic trilateral summit at Camp David. Our trilateral engagement with Japan and the ROK not only brings our three countries into closer coordination, but advances the prosperity and security of the region and beyond. At the Camp David Summit, the partners committed to increased cooperation among our respective development finance institutions to mobilize financing for quality infrastructure across the region, the establishment of a maritime security cooperation framework to synchronize partner capacity building in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, and a senior-level dialogue to discuss coordinating assistance and development of partner countries by focusing on their needs. We are working closely with the European Union to advance our shared vision in the Indo-Pacific. We've held 4 rounds of the US-EU high-level consultations on the Indo-Pacific, which has advanced practical cooperation on maritime security, infrastructure, and foreign information manipulation and interference. The recently signed Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation Corporation and the European Investment Bank will facilitate strategic investments across the region. In March, we held the first US-EU joint naval exercise off the coast of Oman, demonstrating our shared commitment to a free and open maritime order. Lastly, we are exploring trilateral coordination with Japan and the Philippines to deepen cooperation on energy, infrastructure, and digital economy issues, as well as security cooperation on maritime domain awareness, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief efforts. We're building on this growing relationship from the foreign ministers meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly and enhancing cooperation to advance our shared vision for the Indo-Pacific. These developments in the regional architecture have brought new momentum to our efforts to work together with a range of partners to deliver on the needs of the Indo-Pacific region, on issues from maritime security to clean energy, infrastructure, cybersecurity, and more. Through these flexible partnerships, we can leverage the unique capacities of key partners to develop joint or coordinated initiatives and respond more nimbly to shared challenges. They have demonstrated our ability to translate strategic convergence into practical, consequential actions. But these arrangements also represent an important development in our approach to working with regional partners. They reinforce the existing regional architecture by identifying issues that need additional attention, and then working jointly with partners to determine who is best equipped to provide the capacity to address the needs. Moreover, they enable our partners to use their voices as regional leaders and empower them to showcase their own strengths while leveraging collective capacity. These groupings each define their own agenda and decide where they can each add value to the region. Through agile coalitions that address many of the significant challenges in the region, we are building an effective lattice work of overlapping and complementary partnerships. Building connections among partners, allies, and friends is at the core of our Indo-Pacific strategy. We are reinvigorating America's network of partnerships and alliances, deepening our engagement in multilateral institutions, and tapping into longtime relationships and building new coalitions designed to meet the tests of our time. Through implementing our Indo-Pacific strategy and working with our network of partnerships, we are delivering on the needs of the region and placing ourselves at the heart of a global effort to realize the vision of a region that is more dynamic and democratic, prosperous and peaceful, and fair and free. So thank you, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Same here. Thank you for those opening remarks. It's given us a lot to unpack here. And first, just a quick note for our virtual audience. If you have a question for Deputy Assistant Secretary Dawson, please go to askac.org, askac.org, and submit it to us. And for all of you joining in the room, we have a microphone right over there. I'll remind you when it gets closer to our Q&A portion of this discussion, and then you can queue up over there and ask your question. We'll make sure to We're going to have a discussion right now, and then we'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions as well. So be thinking of those now. I'm sure these opening remarks are giving you a lot to unpack and a lot to ask about here. So why don't we jump in? I'm wondering if we can start with a key term you mentioned in your opening remarks, minilateralism. This is a term that is shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific region. It's not just a theoretical concept. You're working on implementing it each and every day. Let's start with the definition of terms. How do you even define what minilateralism is?
Right. Well, I'll maybe push back slightly and say almost the definition of minilateralism is that it doesn't have a clear definition, right? It is flexible, it's fit for purpose, it's nimble. So there's not one set definition. But there are some characteristics, I think, that we think about when we are talking about minilaterals. There's no defined number for what makes up a minilateral grouping, I think we can say roughly more than 2 and usually less than 10, but that's, not always going to be the case. And really the idea of minilateral groupings is that they are flexible, that they can shift to meet the particular challenge that is being presented at the moment. So I have to come back to saying it's not an exact definition, but we all have in mind sort of a general image of what a minilateral grouping is.
And one thing I've been trying to figure out is, why is it having a moment now? Why are we seeing so many minilateral groupings pop up?
Well, I think there are a variety of reasons for that. Part of it is, as I mentioned, not only the United States, but so many other countries and organizations have a defined strategy for the region. So as we all look to implement our strategies, we are also looking for the mechanisms to help us achieve our objectives. And we are seeing that these minilateral groupings are demonstrating the ability to deliver concrete results. And that is really what we are trying to do is, again, going back to our diplomatic variable geometry, right? We've identified the needs, we've identified the problem, and now we have to find the right mechanism to solve that problem. And the minilaterals offer us the flexibility of defining the right group, or deciding upon the right grouping, the right partnership that has the right set of tools or capacities to solve that problem. So I think that is in large part why so many of us are recognizing the significant value that minilateral groupings can bring to the region at this moment.
And I was going to ask about the region. Are you seeing particular value in the Indo-Pacific right now? Like, is there a reason why? I feel like a lot of the groupings that have come up recently have been in the region. What's your sense of why it's particularly sticking in the Indo-Pacific region, proving particularly popular and seeming to gain a lot of traction?
Yeah, well, I have to say that I work specifically on the region,
Right.
so I can't necessarily compare it, to other regions and why it may be sticking more significantly in the Indo-Pacific region. But I do think there are a number of factors at play. The first is that the Indo-Pacific region is a huge geographic scope. And so, sort of just in terms of the number of countries and sub-regions that are included, there's there is a need for multiple entities to be working together to address challenges that present in different ways in different parts of the region. So I think that's one of the factors. I think also going back to the fact that we have defined objectives through our strategy and through the strategies of others who care about the region. We have these specific objectives that we want to achieve, and we've outlined how we can most effectively get there. So, having sort of a roadmap, I think, makes it stick a little bit more, right? Because we know some of the key objectives that we need to obtain, and then of course it's also the fact that there is existing regional architecture in place that already has been identifying problems, working towards solutions for a considerable amount of time. And so what many of these minilateral groupings are doing is to help just knit together the work of the existing regional architecture and to fill in the gaps that exist.
And Amy raised this in her opening remarks too, but one other question I have is, how new is minilateralism really? You know, when people talk about this term, some people harken back to like concert of Europe in the 19th century. In the 20th century, there's obviously like examples like the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group. 21st century, you have the six-party talks over North Korea's nuclear program. So how much is continuity versus change? What would you point to as the most significant new elements of what we're seeing in the region and beyond?
Yeah. So I very much agree with both Amy and you that minilateral groupings are not new in the region, right? There have been examples of minilaterals dating back decades in the region, even starting with sort of the predecessor to ASEAN. You have the six-party talks, as you mentioned. The Quad itself was formed in 2004 in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. So these things are not brand new. Perhaps what is new is, again, the linkage to a strategy and the convergence of so many players who have identified common interest, and the minilateral groupings themselves making the determination that their focus is far beyond information sharing, but is really delivering concrete action. And I think that is also part of why we are hearing more, perhaps, about minilaterals in the region, because there really is this focus on concrete deliverables, understanding the needs from the region, and then taking action to address those needs.
And I want to get to that point on the linkage of these minilaterals to strategy, because in your opening remarks, you mentioned a lot of minilateral groupings. For those keeping score, just to name some of them, the Quad, AUKUS, Partners in the Blue Pacific, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, the U.S. Republic of Korea, Japan Trilateral, U.S.-Japan, Philippines Trilateral, U.S.-EU Indo-Pacific consultations. So that's a lot. And you discussed the goals of each, but I'm wondering how you would articulate the larger purpose of these. How do they fit into and advance the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy more broadly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mentioned in the remarks this concept of a lattice work of overlapping partnerships. And I really like that imagery because it's about bringing together, all these separate but sometimes overlapping pieces and weaving them together so that as a whole, it forms, a very tightly knit, strong, secure lattice work. And in the Indo-Pacific strategy, one of the key concepts that is laid out, one of the 5 pillars of the strategy, is connected. And that's really what this is about. It is bringing together the different groupings, connecting them, taking a broad view of the region as a whole to identify the highest priority needs, and then looking across all of the partners to determine who is best placed, whether as an individual country or organization or as a minilateral or multilateral grouping, to provide the resources and the capacity building that is necessary. So that, as I said, it really is advancing that connected nature of the region, and we think that is sort of a fundamental concept of the Indo-Pacific strategy overall.
How do you prevent the lattice work from producing a patchwork instead? Like, you hear about all these groupings, it feels kind of bewildering at times. How do you work each and every day to make sure that the result of all these minilateral groupings is something coherent rather than kind of fragmented or incoherent policy and strategy from the U.S. perspective, I think.
Yeah, well, I think maybe I can give just a sort of practical example. Oftentimes, if you look at a problem set, right, let's say we have, 15 individuals in a given room, right? And we look at a problem set, all 15 of those people might identify, the same priority and all work towards solving, that one issue. But then there are like 20 other issues that are also important, but we've all been focusing on just the one. So everything else kind of gets left by the side. And I had personally an experience of seeing how this can go a little bit wrong when there's not broad information sharing. A number of years ago, I was serving at an embassy in an unnamed country, and a group of donors from various embassies got together to discuss what we were each funding, what kinds of projects and which organizations those funds were going to. And we had about 15, let's say, country representatives in the room. And what we discovered when we put the information into a spreadsheet is that much of the funding was going to the same issues, even the same organizations, but we all had prioritized other issue sets that were going completely unaddressed. So that's where I think it's critically important to have this lattice work that is overlapping, because if you have entities operating in silos, just communicating sort of one-on-one, then you don't have that information that is flowing across the entire network, and that's where you end up with the patchwork. So I think it's, sort of like by its nature, this lattice work reduces the potential for gaps and patchwork.
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed in your remarks, I don't think I heard you mention China at all. What's your response to those who argue that all these minilateral groupings, they're all an effort for the United States to counter China? I've also heard a more broader critique, which is that these minilateral groupings, risk exacerbating great power competition by, potentially dividing, further deepening divides, between rival power blocks. So, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, I think the groupings form a network, not blocks, right? And so if you're trying to use some visual imagery, I think of it as a Venn diagram with lots of overlapping circles. And when we think about what these groupings are about, fundamentally, these minilateral groupings that the United States and others are participating in, and our Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole, what we try to make very clear is that they are focused on advancing a positive, affirmative vision, and it is a focus on what we are for, not what or who we are against. And I think you can see that quite clearly in the fact that the action and the tangible goods that are being delivered are really focused on addressing the needs of the region and recognizing that we have mutual interest that we are seeking to advance. So again, it's an Indo-Pacific strategy that is about our vision for the region. The region, of course, includes China, but our strategy is a region-wide strategy, and it is not that there is a China strategy which we use for the region. It's exactly the opposite.
Okay. And, one other observation you sometimes hear about minilateral groupings, when you're talking about like definitions, is people talk about that they can sometimes be exclusive in nature, in that relative to kind of more inclusive multilateral organizations that include a wider range of stakeholders. Often these minilateral groupings are formed around common interests that certain countries have on particular issues. And people raise this with questions about, for example, will the Quad ever expand to include other countries in the region, like South Korea, for example, or others? So, what are your thoughts on that kind of observation about the nature of minilateral groupings?
Yeah, I think again, the nature of these minilateral groupings is flexible, right? I don't think that anyone would say that we can predict with accuracy, the membership of a minilateral grouping looking into the future, right? They are intended to be flexible and nimble. And if they need to adjust by adding members or shifting to new issue sets, that's possible within the context of minilateral organizations. What we do know is that with a number of these groupings, because they are quite new, the countries involved or the organizations involved at the moment are still really focused on getting the initial work right and ensuring that there's strong proof of concept before potentially expanding beyond that. But I don't think that is in any way exclusive. It is about ensuring that we're using the mechanism as effectively as we can at this moment in time.
The United States, as you mentioned, you talk about doing a lot of listening with allies. You're not building these groupings on your own. You're doing it in collaboration alongside with allies and partners who sometimes their interests and priorities and values are totally aligned with the United States, and sometimes they're not. And so how do you try, when you're building all of this, and if there are any specific examples that come to mind, interested in those as well, how do you try to factor in those priorities and interests and values of allies, and how do you manage differences when they arise as you're forming and building these proof of concepts?
Yeah, so I'll speak about the Quad as an example there. It is absolutely a partnership among equals when we talk about the Quad. There's not one country driving the agenda. It is all 4 countries coming together and jointly determining what makes sense for the Quad to do together. Certainly, there are many ideas that are presented by one of the Quad partners or the others for consideration, an initiative to be delivered to the region. And the partners will discuss amongst ourselves, and we may decide that, yes, this is something we can all sign on to. And here is how each partner will be able to contribute to its implementation. Or we may decide, because one or more of the partners doesn't, that particular initiative just doesn't resonate with them, or they have, various questions or concerns about it, then we put that aside. So maybe it's just not the right thing to do through the Quad. That doesn't mean it's not, a good idea or a good initiative. Sometimes then that might be taken to one of the other minilateral groupings for possible implementation through that grouping. So it's really just a kind of constant conversation. I can tell you in my own experience in working with the Quad, there are a significant number of working groups addressing a whole range of work streams. And in any given week, there are multiple working group meetings taking place, discussions happening amongst all the Quad partners, and really, just working through what are the initiatives that are, the most ready to be taken into implementation. And so it really is just a continual conversation that we're having.
Yeah, it's interesting. My former colleague, Moises Naim, I think he once defined minilateralism as kind of the smallest number of countries to achieve the most maximal result on a particular issue. It's interesting to hear you describe that, because it seems like that is, it's a little bit of the art of the possible, it sounds like, with these minilateral groupings in terms of figuring out where can we all coalesce on agreement. When you can, that's action for that group. When you can't, it maybe has to move to a different forum.
That's absolutely right.
One thing I'm also curious about is how these groupings interact with the existing regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. So here I'm thinking about, multilateral groupings like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but also bilateral security alliances, with South Korea, with Japan, with other countries in the region. How do you see these minilateral groupings interacting and influencing the pre-existing regional security architecture?
Yeah, well, I would actually sort of start with the reverse. I mean, we do always talk about the existing regional architecture as, being at the center of and guiding what we are doing in the region versus the reverse. So I would start with the existing regional architecture and then think about how the minilateral grouping, some of these newer groupings, can complement what is already there. Maybe one sort of tangible example, and I mentioned this just briefly in my remarks, but this is through the Partners in the Blue Pacific, which brings together, let's see, now I'm going to have to pull from my memory here, but that's the US, UK, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and we have several observers as well. But the Partners in the Blue Pacific has worked to identify items that are, or objectives from the Pacific Island Forum's 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. Specific objectives and initiatives in the Pacific Island Forum strategy. The Partners in the Blue Pacific is now working to implement the specific items that the Pacific Island countries have said, these are things that we would like assistance with. These are things we have identified as priority needs through our existing regional architecture. Let's work together to advance those objectives.
And do you see any? You mentioned that they're complementary in nature. That's a really helpful example of how you see it as complementary. Do you foresee any challenges arising with kind of the energy and focus and activity moving to minilateral groupings from these other platforms, or or is it more that you see it as kind of plugging gaps where those other platforms, whether it's a multilateral organization or a security alliance, where on work they're not otherwise doing?
Yeah, we really see it as covering those gaps, filling in where others are not, currently addressing a given need. Certainly, we are aware that there have been attempts to paint some of these minilateral groupings as seeking to undermine existing regional architecture. And I would say to that, that's absolutely untrue. And I think, though, oftentimes the way to counter a narrative like that is just, again, to focus on the affirmative, to focus on delivering the results, right? That's how we prove to the region what the actual intention of these groupings is.
Yeah. Amy mentioned this concept of hub and spokes, this idea that in the decades after World War II, the prevailing paradigm for the regional security architecture was this model of kind of a hub and spokes model. So picture a kind of wheel of security, right, with the U.S. as the hub at the center of several separate bilateral alliances that are more the spokes. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, et cetera. I'm curious how you think about that concept along with the concept of how things are playing out now. Like, is the hub and spokes model an obsolete model of regional security architecture, or is there still truth to it, but it's not the whole truth, or something else? How do you see that in your mental map of the region and its security architecture? How does that fit in?
Right. So we absolutely continue to place tremendous value on our bilateral alliances and partnerships, as well as the existing regional multilateral architecture. And we think we can add to all of that through these minilateral groupings. And I mentioned previously the image that I use in my mind of the Venn diagram, right? If you think of the hub and spoke, that's sort of one circle, right? The Venn diagram, you've got multiple overlapping circles with some partners in many of those circles, some partners in fewer of those circles, but it's that overlapping nature that creates the lattice work that enables us to have a more cohesive strategy overall, and to bring together the capacity that's needed to meet the needs of the region.
And one thing I will say at the outset, we're nearing time for the Q&A. So for those of you online, go to askac.org if you want to submit your questions, if you haven't already. I'm going to take my privilege as a moderator to ask one more question, but we are then going to open it up to everyone else. So please do queue up at the microphone if you have a question as well. But I am just curious about the broader global context for U.S. policy and Indo-Pacific strategy right now. We're having this conversation at a time where Russia's war against Ukraine is continuing. We are only seeing the war between Israel and Hamas escalate. There are a lot of challenges and conflicts around the world, and I'm curious how you see, is the U.S., from your vantage point, have you been able to sustain the focus on the Indo-Pacific region that you want amid all of these other crises around the world that certainly have to have U.S. attention as well? How do you maintain focus, and have you seen any challenges with maintaining focus on your priorities and your policy and strategy?
Undoubtedly, there are multiple significant events and major challenges happening in various parts of the world, but that does not in any way take away our focus on the Indo-Pacific region. As I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, President Biden himself has said, the Indo-Pacific region really will be the center of geopolitics in this century, and that's remains true. So we have not taken our focus off the region. We will not take our focus off the region. If anything, I think that the events that we have seen, Russia's war of aggression, with the events in Israel and Gaza, it just reinforces the need for vigilance. And we will continue to be very much laser focused on the Indo-Pacific region.
Got it. Okay. Well, with that, I want to make sure we get some questions in from the audience. So I'm actually going to start with a question from the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center. I believe he's able to join us virtually. There he is.
See him
Hello,
on screen.
Marcus. It's great to see you on screen. I'm wondering if we can go to you for the first question.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. And Camille, thank you so much for those great remarks, and to you, Uri, for guiding a great conversation, and of course to Amy for setting the context for all of this. So one of the things that's occurred to me as we consider our strategy in the Indo-Pacific and how to implement that strategy is the changing nature of the challenge to the international order and to a free and open Indo-Pacific. And in particular, one of the concerns that we've highlighted is the nature of the simultaneity of the threats to that order, particularly that both China and North Korea are pressing on that in different ways, supporting Russia now we see, and Russia supporting them in some ways, and so we have in essence almost a adversary minilateral, right, of North Korea, Russia, and China all supporting each other in the Indo-Pacific. So how does this increasing level of cooperation and simultaneity between these three authoritarian states, how does that affect how you approach and how we should approach minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you, Marcus, first of all, for connecting this entire event today and really being the engine to make it happen. On the question, I think that actually it just almost reinforces exactly the critical nature of these minilateral groupings and our strategy overall, right? There really are unprecedented challenges facing the region, and there are potential threats coming from multiple sources. And so that takes me back to really sort of the thesis of my remarks and the main point of our Indo-Pacific strategy, which is no one country can address the needs and the threats alone. We have to do it in close concert with our partners and allies, and that comes in a lot of different forms. And by creating these various groupings, that really provides a multiplier effect, right? The United States is, of course, a great power, and we can do many, many things. But we are better when we are doing that with our strong partners and allies in the region who themselves have many capabilities to offer. And even in the process of developing these minilateral groupings, we are also building up the capacity jointly of all the partners participating in the grouping itself, as well as delivering capacity for the region. So it's all about shoring up resilience, building capacity, and through all of that, we create a deterrent effect for would-be threat actors.
Absolutely. The brilliant insights. I completely agree.
Okay, all right, why don't we go to a question in the room, and then I'm going to take some questions from our virtual audience as well. So over to you, and if you could just identify yourself at the beginning, that would be great.
I'm Harlan Ullman, Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council. It's interesting that the first time the word China came up was when Uri asked the question. And one wonders if China did not exist, or if we're an ally, we'd be doing this, but that's not my question. Please help me understand how this is integrated across the rest of government. The National Security Strategy said that China is the pacing threat. The National Defense Strategy says that the aims are to compete, deter, and if war comes, defeat. And we're embarking on a campaign, a plan of campaigning. So I do not understand whether you have an independent operation here in minilateralism. For example, AUKUS is clearly a threat directed against China with nuclear submarines, period. So how do you see yourself integrating with the broader strategy with China and the other parts of our national security and defense strategy? Or do you see yourself as a more or less an independent operation, just doing it because it needs to be done?
So the Indo-Pacific strategy is absolutely a whole of government endeavor that was drafted by the National Security Council with input provided by agencies across the whole of government. And its implementation is also done through a whole of government approach led by the White House National Security Council. The Indo-Pacific strategy, our US Indo-Pacific strategy, does not shy away from recognizing the threat that China presents to the region. That's identified in the first page of the Indo-Pacific strategy. That is the context in which the Indo-Pacific strategy is developed. My point earlier is simply that China is a part of the region. We have a China strategy that is, within the Indo-Pacific strategy, but our actions across the region and our strategy and vision for the region is fundamentally about ensuring the peace, prosperity, stability, and resilience of the region itself. And that's really where our focus is. But I can assure you it's a whole of government approach that is absolutely in alignment with the other strategies that you mentioned.
Okay, so I'm going to go to one question from the virtual audience and then over to you next. So this is an interesting question from Kevin Wheeler. As a military member, I appreciate your comments and see multilateralism as a viable way forward. Strong bonds enhance our robustness. My concern comes from motivating the next generation to share our vision. How do we get the American people excited about this strategy? With a positive information campaign showing the good the U.S. is doing abroad? Is it through championing exchange students and employees currently helping us all move closer toward our goals of a connected world? Something else? Thank you for your perspective. And I know you have a long background in public diplomacy too, so I'm curious, what you think about that.
Yeah, I love this question. It's a terrific question. One of actually the key goals of this administration in terms of our foreign policy is speaking to the American people to allow for a better understanding of why foreign policy matters to America. And in this specific case, why does the Indo-Pacific region matter to America? And we have a number of ways that we are seeking to inform Americans to enhance that understanding. In fact, one of my colleagues who's here in the audience, her specific role is really focused on that. It is about getting our message out to audiences across the United States to understand how our engagement with the Indo-Pacific region benefits American people, American communities. And we do that in a large number of ways. It includes, our State Department personnel or other U.S. government personnel getting out to various parts of the United States, speaking to a whole range of audiences, many of whom, we have not traditionally engaged with in the past. And it is really looking at and sharing information with these audiences about the ways in which their communities intersect with and benefit from the relationship with the Indo-Pacific region. Sometimes that's more obvious in certain parts of the country, right? On the West Coast, it seems a little more obvious about why trade with the Indo-Pacific region is so vital. But we see it in, pretty much every city and every state across the United States. There is an interest, there should be an interest in this region. It's everything from the tuition dollars that foreign students from the region bring to communities across the United States. It's our trade and investment relationships, the trade that creates American jobs. You know, the Indo-Pacific region accounts for 2/3 of global GDP growth. I mean, there are real, concrete, tangible reasons that American communities should care about what's happening in the region, because it affects sort of our, our pocketbooks. And I also love the question about exchange programs. And I will just mention that I personally believe very strongly in the value of people-to-people exchange, and ensuring that individuals from the United States have opportunities to interact with citizens of the Indo-Pacific region and vice versa, because it is very often those relationships that form the foundations of strong, stable bilateral relationships, and go beyond that even to networks across the region. So I couldn't agree more with the question, and just really thank the individual for asking it.
Okay, all right. Well, why don't we go to another question in the room? Over to you.
Thank you. Andrew Scott with the Open Mind Project. My question is related to the increasing trade restrictions, especially around like high technology chips, AI. So obviously our strategy since the 70s was to facilitate increasing trade with China. Ended up moving much of our manufacturing base, which was very profitable for multinationals. But now China seems to be restricting military communication. One of the recent Atlantic Council speakers was talking about it. And so I'm just curious about your opinion of our increasing trade restrictions affecting lines of communication, and are we sort of falling into a increasing a bipolar world by driving wedges with these sort of escalating tactics? Thank you.
And sorry, just to make sure I understand the question, is that are you asking specifically about U.S.-China trade, or?
Well, yeah, specifically just within the last couple of days, we increased those restrictions on exports of chips and AI technology. So
so certainly we've had a number of officials from the U.S. government address this question, or a similar variation of the question in recent months. But I think it has been best described as there are certain things we need to restrict in the interest of our national security. I think we can all understand that and respect that. But it has been described as the need to put in place a high fence around a small yard, right? Really identifying the very specific technologies or items that are of concern, and ensuring those do not fall into the hands of those who would use those technologies in ways that could potentially be used to threaten U.S. national security or that of our partners and allies, right? So we all want to avoid that, but we want to do it in a smart way that minimizes overflow to other areas which would not have an impact on our national security interest.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. So why don't you come up and ask?
Sure. Rocco Santuri, financial advisor, part-time soldier for the U.S. government. The question I had, you mentioned the trying to reach the American populace. I would like to know what the associated I.O. campaign is for the global audience, which I think sometimes we fall a little short on. And lastly, in terms of the efforts that are being taken right now, is there the necessary codification or institutionalization to keep these going forward in the event that there's a seismic shift after November of next year?
So I'll address a couple of different aspects there. So the first is in terms of, I think what you refer to as IO, I would refer to as, and I assume by that you mean information operation. In diplomatic, in the State Department context, we utilize public diplomacy and strategic messaging. And we absolutely have public diplomacy campaign to inform audiences not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but really around the globe about the US Indo-Pacific strategy and what we seek to achieve through the strategy. And we advance that public diplomacy through a variety of means. We have our public diplomacy teams at embassies around the region who are both, pushing out messaging, but also are continually in listening mode. And I, go back to that point, right? Because it's not just about putting information out, it's also about pulling information in so that we understand what audiences are interested in, what resonates with them, what does not, so that we can continually adjust and refine and ensure that we are taking into account the local context and respecting the audience themselves so that we can create that state of mutual understanding. And just a little side note there, which is that one of the primary objectives listed in our Indo-Pacific strategy is expanding our diplomatic presence in the region. And that's something that we have really been able to make great progress on over the past 2 years. And so we are able to better do our public diplomacy in the region because we have now more people on the ground in countries across the region and have been able to open a number of new embassies. And I am now forgetting the last part of the question. I'm sorry.
Just in terms of these programs going forward, if there's after the
yes.
presidential election.
Yes. So actually, I think that's a great sort of last question because what I can say with a great deal of confidence is that our commitment to the Indo-Pacific region is rock solid, and it is not going to change, no matter what administration is in power. And I think you can see direct evidence of that in the fact that in a Congress, in a U.S. Congress, that doesn't have a whole lot of bipartisan agreement on things these days, there is really tremendous bipartisan support for implementation of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, for advancing our goals in the region. And we see that regularly from the Hill. And finally, taking us back to that lattice work that I mentioned, another real benefit of that, right, is it is interwoven. That makes it stronger. It is not easily broken apart. So having these overlapping networks means that our participation in groupings in the architecture of the region is solid and will be for a long time to come.
Okay. Well, an important point to end on. Thank you so much for those remarks, and thank you to everyone for the great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the virtual ones. There were many, so it sparked a lot of interesting conversation. But thank you all for that. Now I'm going to go to Amy Seawright for some closing remarks before we wrap. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Uri and Camille, for such a rich discussion. I think we've answered a lot of questions today, have a lot more insight into a few things. The what of what is this new diplomatic variable geometry as it pertains to the Indo-Pacific. The what purpose, what kinds of things are these frameworks already achieving and what are we seeking to achieve through them? And also, why now? And just to add a little bit of reflection onto the why now, I think some really interesting points were made about the shared vision and common purpose of many of our partners in the region as they develop their strategies for the region, the ability of these frameworks to achieve practical results. I would just add a couple of other things or emphasize a couple of other factors. I think one reason of the why now is the strength of our bilateral alliances. For many years, as I started my remarks saying, the United States was very focused on a hub and spokes system of bilateral security alliances, and there was a lot of effort put into strengthening our alliances in Asia-Pacific, now we call it Indo-Pacific, our alliances with Japan, for example, the ROK, Australia. Now we have a whole bunch of new agreements, and these alliances have really matured. We have the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the Philippines for rotational presence agreements with Australia. So these alliances are ready to sort of graduate, and our partners are really interested in becoming more interlinked together, linking the spokes of the hub and spoke system, which I think has motivated a lot of our minilateral frameworks, and then adding in new partners or increasingly important partners on our defense and security side, such as India. And the other that was mentioned is the gap in the regional security architecture. And here I just think, since we're at the Atlantic Council, it's worth a moment just thinking about the comparison that's often made between the transatlantic security architecture and the Indo-Pacific security architecture. Because in the transatlantic space, for ever since the early post-war years, it has been anchored by NATO, which offers very clearly delineated geographic boundaries and geometry, and clear legal obligations through which the allies can act and mechanisms to get things done. And it bolstered by the European Union on the economic side and political side. So it's a very rational, functional set of organizations that fit together and work very well. And on the Indo-Pacific side, for years, we've had a much messier picture with overlapping, sometimes fragmented, multilateral organizations that include many of our adversaries that have incentives to try to minimize or even prevent cooperation in certain areas, and hampered by very slow and consensus-driven decision-making, which can make their outcomes somewhat disappointing. So the middle level between the bilateral security alliances and the multilateral organizations, this middle level of minilateral frameworks, has long been there, but I think now it makes sense now to really look to build out that layer and weave it together, as Camille was saying, with the multilateral and the bilateral side of things. So thank you so much for your discussion, and thank you all for participating, and have a great evening.